Well folks, it's finally time to review the iconic 3.5 gallon American Standard Cadet on Flushometer. A toilet made since the early 1980s and made up until 1996. This is probably one of the most iconic older toilets of all time, especially from the 3.5 gallon era. But how well has it aged? Well, let's find out. For starters, the overall design of this is very similar to the original Flushometer Cadet from the 1960s to 70s. As you can see, it is very similar. Not really much to point out on the outer design. It's really where the flush, where it's different. There's the iconic opening, which is obviously based on the 4th generation Cadet on tank. And overall, there really isn't much to point out here. It's basically just a bowl. It's pretty simplistic, although it does have a very iconic design. So the difference between this version of the Cadet and the older version from the 60s to 70s is the flush. The flush is definitely a lot different here. While the older version goes for the more tank style flush, but more powerful, this one has a completely unique flush. Let's have a look at it now. As you can tell, it definitely has a different flush. It's also a lot more noisier, but compared to the older version, I like the flush on this one a lot better. Now let's talk about a few of the issues I do have with this toilet, and this kind of goes into the pull-in siphon power. Now, most of the time it's pretty good, but with that one, you may see that the siphon can be a little bit scuffed sometimes, very similar to the 3.5 gallon Color Welcome toilet. The siphon is alright for the most part, but the pulling factor can be a little bit scuffed as well, especially depending on pressure. If it's on higher pressure, there might be a chance that some shreds might happen. Another issue I would like to point out, and this is something I've only seen a few times, but still worth pointing out, is that sometimes stuff can get stuck on the lip of the Trapway. I don't know why that happens, but I have seen it a few times, which leads to some shredding issues. Again, shredding isn't terrible compared to some other toilets, but it's still something to point out. It's alright in pull factor, but it definitely could have been worked on a little bit, especially in terms of quality. Now, one of the most iconic things about this toilet is the performance. This thing can be unstoppable sometimes. It's actually kind of insane. Granted, the tank cadets also have some of the same feats with the 4th generation, so seeing it ported over here very well from the tank to the Flushometer variant is very impressive. These things can be very hard to clog. I mean, it's actually kind of insane, which means these things have a pretty long lifespan because of that. And I think it really has to do with the quality of the Cadet and just the 4th generation design overall. Ball rinse is an interesting story. Let's take a look at it. Ball rinse for the most part is pretty good. There might be some areas missed, especially in the back area, but it is covered pretty well, especially with the swirl and the angled rim jets, which definitely do help. And that's pretty much it with the 3.5 gallon version of the American Standard Cadet on Flushometer. This toilet is iconic for many different reasons, and it's iconic to see this thing still thriving in the world, minus a lot of scummations and all that stuff. Sure, there might be some aspects that I don't like about it, like the pulling factor, being a little bit scuffed, but besides that, this thing still has some pretty good qualities, like performance and flush. There's so many reasons why this thing is so iconic, and I can completely understand why. But let's grade it. While it's just the bowl, the overall design is still pretty interesting. Sure, it might look kind of plain at first, but honestly this has a very strange design. And you may or may not agree with me though, it's kind of a timeless design. Yeah, it doesn't look too old, but it also doesn't look too new either. It's somewhere in the middle, and it's kind of interesting. I give it a 6. And going to be honest, the quality control is just okay. Honestly, I think there are some design aspects that do kind of bring this down a little bit. One being the siphon power. It can be a little bit scuffed, just like the 3.5 gallon color welcome. While this problem is a rare one, sometimes a few items can get stuck in the lip, leading to some shredding issues. Not a great design aspect, but again, not as problematic as the original Flushometer Cadet from the 60s and 70s. A lot less common. And then finally, probably the biggest one, and this is not something I usually bring up, but this can be pretty loud. I don't usually talk about loud toilets until we get to, like, say, the Kohler High Crest review or reviewing one of the many Sloan Flushometer bowls. Loudness is not something I really talk about, and as iconic as the flushing sound of the 3.5 Flushometer Cadet is, it can be quite annoying to some others. It's definitely not going to give you ear damage, but it's probably not going to be very pleasant to listen to for some people. Overall, I give it a 6. Consistency is pretty good. I mean, most of these look pretty similar to another, and maybe some slight crookedness here and there, but it is pretty well covered. I give it an 8. At first, the Trapway doesn't look to be all that pleasing, but the Trapway on these are pretty good size. It may not look like that from the opening, but these things have pretty good sized Trapways, especially for what they are. You'd honestly be impressed how well these things could perform with these Trapways. Because of that, I'm giving it an 8. Time for a hot take. The 3.5 version of the Flushometer Cadet flushes a lot, and I mean a lot better than the original version from the 60s and 70s. I mean, the flush is just so unique, and it's really great. Very powerful, very swirly, and very exciting to see. Even though the swirly flush has been done 1,000 times over. But this one is definitely one of the most unique swirly flushes I've seen. And it seems no matter what pressure it's on, it always seems powerful. Pretty much similar to the 3.5 color welcome toilet. No matter what pressure it's on, it always seems powerful regardless of pressure. And this is something I really do appreciate about this, and even the 3.5 Madeira. I give the flush a 9. If I only really have a complaint for this toilet, is that the pull and siphon is not the greatest. The siphon generally is alright, although, as seen, it can be a bit scuffed sometimes. But then you got the pulling factor, and it's just kind of a weird mess, though I've seen far worse. I have noticed with many high-pressure toilets, the higher the pressure, the slightly higher chance the shredding problem is. And then you also got the effect of some things sometimes getting stuck on the lip of the Trapway. Again, not as common as its previous version, but still an issue nonetheless. It's just a bit disappointing how kind of not great the pull is, and you would think it would be a little bit better. Ideally, you want this thing on like medium or maybe even lower pressure for this thing to do pretty well most of the time. But because of that, I'm going to have to give it a 5. Now let's talk about one of the greatest things about this toilet, the performance. It is absolutely tremendously unstoppable. Finding one of these clogged, normally speaking, is about as rare as finding Bigfoot. These are very tough to clog, and they do their jobs fairly well, disregarding the shredding issue we talked about last time. But besides that, the performance is just amazing. It gets a perfect 10. The ball rinse also is not bad at all. It does pretty well. Maybe the back rim will suffer a little bit, but concerning the angled rim jets, it shouldn't be that much of a problem compared to some other toilets from this timeline, especially toilets with deeper balls. Thankfully, the ball on this one is not that deep, so rinse is not too much of a problem. Overall, I give it a 7. Due to the amazing performance, these things will last a very long time. And I mean a very long time. These things can hold up exceptionally well. I think maybe the only thing drawing back is the pull and the siphon factor, but besides that, these things can last. I give it a 9. Let's talk about the overall value. A lot of people consider this to be one of the greatest toilets of all time. I somewhat agree with that. These things are pretty good overall, but the only problem I have with this toilet is the pulling factor being a bit scuffed and a little bit underwhelming for what it is. And besides that, some of the quality control could be a little bit better, especially with some of the issues this might provide a rub. But besides that, everything else works pretty good. The flush is exciting and probably the best out of all the cadets in general. That's including tank. The performance is just unstoppable. The Bowens is also not too bad, and these things can last a very long time. Again, some quality aspects do kind of drag this thing down a little bit, but yeah, I really do like these toilets. I can see why a lot of people like this toilet. It could have been a little bit better, but compared to its original design on Flushometer from the 60s and 70s, this thing is definitely a lot better. I give it a 7. The final score of the 3.5 gallon American Standard Cadet on Flushometer is a 75 out of 100. If it wasn't for some of the few issues that it has, this would definitely be one of the greatest toilets of all time, but it is still fairly good. Again, some of the quality aspects and the pulling factor do kind of drag it down a little bit, but a lot of the other aspects of this are really great. The flush, the performance, and just the overall durability of these things just make this one of the most iconic toilets of all time.